Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. You know, I've gotten a lot of questions over the last year while I've been doing these videos regarding rods. Rod building is something that I have done for the last 5 or 6 years. Everything I use are rods that I've built. I truly love it, and I think it gives me an advantage because I feel like I know what rod is right for me with the techniques and the baits that I'm using. Not every rod is right for everybody for the same technique. And even within the same technique, I've got rods that I prefer for one bait and rods that I prefer for a different bait. So if I'm talking deep diving crankbaits, I may be throwing two 20-foot diving crankbaits on two different rods because those crankbaits run differently and they react differently if I'm using different rods. And I feel like because I've been building rods, I have the ability to tell better what I like versus what I don't like and what I think what rod may help a bait run better. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've used a bait and at the end of that time using it was like, I didn't really like it. But if I tie that bait on a different rod, it's like a whole different world. It's like, oh my God, I love the way that that bait runs. I love the way it reacts. And I caught fish on it. And that's because you were using the right rod. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that anglers run into today at all levels is they don't have the ability to try out tons of rods for different baits. And because, you go out and you buy the rod that you think is going to be right, it may not be right and you end up not liking that rod even though there's nothing wrong with the rod. I mean, really for the most part, the majority of rods that are on the market now are good quality. And the low end rods that are on the market right now are the same rods that were high end rods 15 years ago. So, I mean, it's one of those things where there's been so many advances in rods, they just keep getting more sensitive and they keep getting more specialized that there are so many choices out there that it is very, very overwhelming, especially when they cost as much as they do. It's hard to go buy a rod and hit a home run with it every time. The best thing that can happen, at least for me, one of the best things was I found a rod I really liked and it was a multitask rod where I could use it for a lot of different things. And I would just go buy multiples of that same rod. Like that was the best. The worst was when you bought a rod going, I want this because everyone says it's supposed to be great for top waters. You get it, you use it, and you're like, I don't like it at all for top waters. That happens a lot. So, what I want to talk about today are just kind of the components of rods and what you can learn from just the components in the rods. I'm not really talking much about power. We'll dabble in it a little bit, but it's more about components of these rods. I build all my own rods. These are all going to be components I get through mudhole.com. All the blanks I use are MHX blanks, which are through mudhole.com. And I really, really like them. And again, that's one of those things when you find, if you're a rod builder, when you find the blanks you like and ones that react the way that you like them to react with the components that you choose, then that's what you stay with. I mean, I've stuck with MHX because they build blanks that just seem to work well for me and I understand them now. So when they come out with a new blank, and it's like in this case, this is an NMB 873.5 power. So two of my favorite rods were the 873 and 874. And all that means is they're a 7 foot, an 873. So it's a 7 foot 3 inch rod. And then the last number there is the power of the rod. So an 873 is a 3 power. The 874 is a 4 power. But when they came out with the NMB 873.5, that's a 3.5 power of the same length blank and the same blank. So I just knew it was going to be in between the 3 and the 4 power, which are two of my favorite rods. So what I'm getting at is because I'm familiar with that one rod, I was able to go, you know what, I have a really good idea of what that 3.5 power is going to be. When people jump from brand to brand, which isn't a bad thing to do, there's a lot of differences. One brand's medium heavy is another brand's heavy. It's hard to judge them all just based on looking at them and saying, I like this at one company and this at another company. That's one thing that is just even more confusing. There's no set guideline as to what is truly a medium heavy, what's a heavy. Those are all brand specific. That's their own rating system. So you need to be aware of that. So we're going to talk about a couple of things here. Just the labeling in itself, a couple of misconceptions on here. So anytime you buy a rod, they tell you on here, suggested line size to use and suggested lure size to use. So in this case, this NMB 873.5 is for 10 to 20 pound test and 3/8 ounce to 1 ounce lures. Those are suggestions, guys. Those are what they believe will work best with the rod to prevent it from being very much overloaded. But at the same time, it also is suggesting what you may be, this rod may be overpowering for. So if you wanted to use a bait that's under the 3/8 ounce size, you can do that, but the rod may not load up exactly how you want it to load up. So those are suggestions. It says only up to 1 ounce. You can throw an 1.5 ounce or 2 ounce bait, but you have to be aware that you may overpower the rod if you try to really load the rod up and wing a 2 ounce weight a quarter mile. You may end up breaking the rod. But it doesn't mean you cannot go outside of those line recommendations as well as the weight recommendations. Those are strictly recommendations to help you kind of decide what the rod is for. When it comes down to the size and the length of the rod, like I said, all rod brands, their ratings are different. And one medium heavy is different from another medium heavy. The same thing for, when you're talking about length, the length really comes down to what an angler prefers. If you've got a long rod, it's probably going to increase your casting dramatically. But if you're flipping in really tight quarters with lots of overhanging trees, you may not want a 8-foot rod. You may want to downsize to a 7-foot rod. So you need to be aware of what's best for you. If you're a bank fisherman, shorter rods are generally going to be better unless you want to make that really long cast, and then you'd want a longer rod. But if you're in tight quarters from the bank where you get trees all over the place, shorter rods are easier to handle. But don't think just because a rod is longer really means anything. It only really helps you cast further, get more potential leverage on a fish. And it's something where, for me, I love short rods for a lot of things. So don't just think long rods are better. I've heard that from so many people where they just want to keep going longer and longer and longer. But the reality is there's a lot of things you can't do with a long rod that you can do for a short rod. So you want to find a rod that works best for you from a length standpoint. When you're talking components, you can see I use the wind grips here, and I like a split grip. That's all just choice. There's a couple reasons I like the split grip. One, I prefer grabbing the ball. When I cast, I always put my offhand on the bottom of the rod and use that for leverage. I like that better than a full handle, and I like the wind grips because I get much better grip out of it than, say, a cork handle. Before I went to the wind grips, it was not uncommon for me. I mean, several times a year I'd go to make a cast and the whole rod would slip out of my hands because of the way I cast. And I would end up, I've lost several rods from that standpoint. With the wind grips, they really just kind of stick more in my hand, and I have better feel and better traction out of them when it's rainy out, and in cold conditions, I feel like they hold heat better than, say, a cork handle. It did take me a little time to get used to the split grip, but I do prefer it. The other reason is I feel like the more exposed blank you can have, the more sensitive everything's going to be. It does take away some weight off the rod, but again, it's something you just have to kind of learn to like if you are used to the full grip. Same thing with the reel seat. The whole key with the reel seat, in my opinion, is finding a reel seat that fits your hand. Everyone's fingers are different. The lengths and the widths of your fingers. I like a reel seat that has some exposed blank, as you can see right here. That's just so when I have my hand on it, when I'm holding the rod, I will feel some sensitivity out of that. Doesn't mean it's the right thing. I just prefer it, and these, really fit good in my hand. So the reel seat is really about trying to select something that works for you. I also do not like to have any sort of top grip on my rods. I just put a check. As you can see, there's just a little check that's put there, and then I've epoxy over that. And that's, again, so I can put my fingers, when I'm holding the rod, I can put my top fingers on the blank. There's nothing breaking up the sensitivity from the rod blank to my fingers. Totally up to you. you know, and one thing that a lot of people always argue about is your hook keeper. You know, I've got different hook keepers that I like to use with different blanks. Uh, that's really just something that's personal preference. But I can tell you this: there's some brands out there that you may buy that have a hook keeper that you don't like at all. So you do want to take it into account. It's such a small little piece that's added to the rod, but it really can bother you if it's the wrong hook keeper. There's even rods out there that don't come with a hook keeper at all. So it's something you want to be aware of. When it comes down to the guides, and I'm going to try not to break my rod. When it comes down to the guides, guys, you kind of have three different types of guides just in size. You've got your normal running guides, you've got a micro running guide, and you've got kind of a hybrid. These are kind of semi-micro guides that I prefer to use. The real difference when it comes to guides is it's going to allow you to get potentially better casting accuracy, as well as better distance when you go with the micro guides. The reason for that is the line coming off your reel, you get what they call the cone of flight. So your line is coming off and it's generally going to be spiraling or all over the place. And all your guides are trying to do is bring that line that's moving all over into a straight line. If you can get it down into a tight straight line, that's going to increase your casting, which should allow you to also increase your casting accuracy. So the thing here though is if you're throwing micro guides are really meant more for casting. If you want to go flip with micro guides, you're going to end up a lot of times wrapping those small guides around the line just because of the motion that you're doing, and it can become really, really frustrating. They're also not as strong as a full-size guide. So if you're most big time flippers will tell you they prefer just standard guides because of the fact that when you're just pitching or fishing close range, your casting accuracy is going to be fine regardless because it's such a short range thing. But you want the strength of the additional guides, and it just seems to work better, and you don't get tangled. If you're flipping all day with a bigger guide, you get way less times where the line wraps around the micro guides. I use a kind of a semi. It's in the middle, so I can try to capitalize on both a little bit of additional length as well as not getting tangled up all the time with the micro guides. But this is personal preference, and a lot of it is the way you like to fish. You know, if you talk to a lot of ledge fishermen that fish down on the TVA system, a lot of those guys really like the micro guides because they can cast a quarter mile. But if you're talking about people who fish up here on the Mississippi River and like to flip and fish heavy cover, generally speaking, they would prefer just the regular guides. But it's something to be familiar of because there are so many different options out there now. So guys, the rods are very much individual. One rod that is right for you may be wrong for somebody else. So it's important to try to find the right rod to maximize getting the full potential out of the rod and the baits that you choose. Don't think just because the rod you buy says it's made for spinner baits means that's all you can use it for. You may find that you love that rod for 25 other things, but not spinner baits. So just, it's one of my pet peeves is when a company labels a rod as spinner bait, frog, flippin', because it may not be right for you guys out there. But I hope this was helpful. I've had a ton of requests regarding different components for rods and what I like to use, and really what are the differences. And it's not, the blank is the biggest thing. The blank is what's going to allow you to choose whether it's right for the techniques that you're using. The one thing I have not talked about is the power or the speed of the rod. Most rods are rated anywhere from a medium to a medium to a moderate to a moderate fast to a extra fast or a fast or extra fast action rod. That really is going to talk about the speed of the rod in terms of when you load up. A moderate rod will have more bend in the middle of the rod. A extra fast rod, the absorption of the rod will be in the very tip of the rod. If you're fishing deep offshore stuff and you're making really long casts, the extra fast rod will allow you to drive home that hook better because you've got more backbone here. But if you're fishing, say, a chatterbait or a swim jig or something where the fish are coming up and biting it, or a swim bait and you want them to engulf the bait, a lot of times you want a little bit softer rod, so more of a moderate fast rod, so that when the fish sucks it in, the rod bends in a little bit, allowing them to suck that bait in. So it's important to understand the action and the speeds of the rod as well, because it really can change the day. If you go frog fishing with a moderate fast or a moderate action rod, that's much more of that kind of that noodle, you're probably never going to drive the hooks home in that frog. You want a fast action frog rod so that you can drive the hooks home. But again, if you're throwing a crankbait where you've got exposed hooks, you probably want more of a moderate fast rod versus an extra fast, because you want that fish to engulf that bait, suck it in, and it's got exposed hooks, so you don't really have to drive the hook home hard to stick it in their mouth. So guys, I hope that was helpful. Lots of different parts. We will be doing more rod videos and talking more in depth about it, but this is just kind of a general overview on rods that I hope was helpful. I hope gives a little bit of a breakdown to some of you guys who are looking to get into the rod market and buy a new rod for this upcoming spring. Lots of different choices out there. Don't let it overwhelm you. So guys, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned for tomorrow's video.